So, welcome to our first proper silver webinar. So, I get to talk into cyberspace here and trust you're out there listening. It's a little bit of a strange experience that I haven't quite got used to yet, but I'm going to fire away here and hope this all works. So, we've called this A is for Alignment and decided to use the Essentials book as a framework for these early webinars. And I'm aware that amongst you folks listening, I've got everybody from some quite experienced coaches to some folks I don't know, and probably some folks who, from your introductions in the lounge, have struggled with your bodies over time. So I've got a very wide-ranging audience here, and I hope that I can do a good sweep of saying things that are basic enough for folks who are really coming across this for the first time and folks who are well versed in this. So A is for alignment, and my premise here is that we're looking for a shoulder, hip, heel vertical line in the rider. So within our established ways of talking about riding, we have the idea of a shoulder-hip vertical line, and everybody's heard of that, but hardly anybody does it. Many people pay lip service to the idea, but hardly anybody does it. And I think there are two reasons for that. One is it's really not easy. And the other is that our basic tenets of riding also say lower leg on the girth. And if you go lower leg on the girth, you're likely to stick your foot forward to do it. And of course, the other thing everybody knows is heels down. And if you're determined to get your heels down at all costs, you are going to put your lower leg forward because that will make your heel point towards the horse's knee. And anybody can put their lower leg forward and get their heel to point to the horse's knee. But very few people could get their horses to aim towards their heels to aim towards the horse's hock. So on your screen, you should have one of the drawings from Essentials. And this drawing was actually done from a photograph. The rider is called Ebba von Essen. She's a young Swedish rider, although not so young anymore. At this point, she was a working student with Kira Kirkland, and this was done from a photograph that was taken of her riding Amiral, who is the horse that Kira rode in the Olympics in Atlanta. And Eva here is in a really nice shoulder hip heel, and she's pretty much got her heel to point towards the horse's hock rather than the horse's knee. So she is doing the kind of organization that takes a much more flexible ankle than pointing your heel towards the horse's knee, which anybody can do by just sticking their leg forward. But when your foot is back under you in that position, many people struggle to get their heel lower than their toe, let alone their heel aiming towards the horse's hock. And actually the archetypal riders who do that the best are Spanish school riders. And when you look at them, you really see that shoulder, hip, heel line. So when a horse and rider first appear in front of me, one of the first questions I ask myself is, if we took the horse out from underneath the rider by magic, how would the rider land on the riding arena? And when you look at Ebba here, I think it's quite clear that if we took the horse out from underneath her, she would plop down on the riding arena on her feet and would land in a martial arts position. And as you look at her as well, you can see that if you look at her torso, the length of her front, kind of from her ponytail and the nape of her neck down to the back of her backside. Sorry, the length of her back from her ponytail and the nape of her neck down to the back of her backside. And the length of her front from her collarbone to her pubic bone match, which means that her torso is pretty much box shaped. So I'm going to put another photograph up here. So this is a photograph of a rider on a course at my riding centre here, riding my pony Ellie, who was put to sleep earlier this year, sadly, at a ripe old age. I don't even know what it was. So here you've got a rider, again, doing a pretty good shoulder, hip, heel, but clearly not the kind of quality of oomph in her body that Ebba has. So this rider has her foot underneath her, but her heel is a little higher than her toe. And whilst a lot of people would freak out about that, that doesn't worry me. I can live with that perfectly well if I can get the baseline of, if we took the horse out from underneath her by magic, she'd land on the riding arena on her feet. And the length of her front pretty much matches the length of her back. But where she's really different to Ebba is even in that drawing. So I'm going to take that one out there. So you've got a little miniature photograph, hopefully there on the right, and the bigger drawing of Ebba on the left. If you look at Ebba, what you've got is a quality in her body that makes her muscles kind of look like they're stretched elastic bands, like there's a stretch that goes to her thigh and to her calf that you don't see in my other rider who was riding Ellie. So we've got this idea of a shoulder hip heel line. We know that is in the conventional literature. I didn't make this idea up. We know that hardly anybody does it. Most people don't do it because they're thinking heels down, or they don't do it because they're thinking lower leg on the girth, or they don't do it because it's just too difficult, or they don't do it because they're just doing what comes naturally to their body, which could be whatever it is. So let's come back to the idea of the torso. So essentially in the torso, you've got two hinges. One is the hinge at the hip joint. And from the hinge in the hip joint, you would either lean forward or lean back. So leaning forward closes the hinge of the hip joint and would make the front of your torso come closer to the front of your thighs. And leaning back opens the hinge of the hip joint and makes the front of your torso come further away from the front of your thighs. The other hinge is the hinge in your lumbar spine. So between your ribs and your hips, your spine should have a very slight curve forward, but in these riders, you can see that curve is not very obvious. So as you're sitting in your chairs, it would be really good to do an exercise where you get to sit on your hands. So I recommend you uncross your legs, get your feet flat on the floor, sit on your hands. You might be more comfortable doing this palm down. And hopefully, as you sit on your hands, you're going to find these two bony little seat bones in your butt. And if you can get your front and your back to be the same length, your seat bones will point down. And if you hollow your back and lift your chest, feel what happens on your fingers and where your seat bones point then. And I hope it's going to be clear to you that your seat bones point back. And if you can drop your chest down again, your seat bones should get clearer on your fingers and to the point where they point down. And if you then round your back, your seat bones are going to point forward. And at this point in time, your front gets shorter. And I hope you can't hear this, but I've just realized there's a snoring dog in a dog crate in the background of this. So if you can hear snoring, it's the dog. It's not me or anybody else, but there is a snoring dog in the background here. So I'm obviously pretty boring to the dog. All right, so come back to seat bones down again. And let's do that again. So if you elongate your front, your chin lifts, your chest lifts, your back hollows, your seat bones point back, and you've become banana-shaped with your front longer than your back. And from there, drop your chin, drop your chest, feel your seat bones move on your hands to where they point down, and then round your back, feel your seat bones point forward, your front gets shorter, your back gets longer, your seat bones have rolled forward on your fingers. You're now banana-shaped with the long side of the banana being your back, and then from there, come to neutral. So two of the definitions we could make on neutral spine are that the length of your front matches the length of your back and your seat bones point down. So you might want to rescue your fingers from under your hands, and depending on how hard your chair is, you might have mashed your fingers somewhat. So at this point, you should be at least close to what we call neutral spine. And in the DVD snippet section of this, there's a really nice snippet from the beginning of the Rider's Guide to Body Awareness DVD, which shows my colleague Anne Howard, who's a physical therapist, demonstrating neutral spine on me and somebody else. And if you're in that neutral posture and somebody pushed down on your shoulders, what would happen is your weight would go straight down onto your seat bones. You could imagine if you were round-backed and somebody pushed on your shoulders, your back would splay out the back. And if you were hollow-backed and somebody pushed on your shoulders, your front would become longer and your back would become shorter, and that would be a pretty nasty, ouchy kind of experience. But if you ever do the neutral spine exercise, it's an interesting sensation for both the person and the tester, in the way that your weight just goes straight down through the column of your torso to your seat bones, which are already pointing down, and there are no wiggles or jiggles or peculiar things that stop that from happening. So getting your front equal to your back, getting your seat bones pointing down, and really recognizing that we have these two hinges, the hinge of the hip joint and the hinge of the middle back. So those hinges are very significant, and very few people really get their brain around how to operate those two hinges. So people might come out in front of me, I look at the rider and I ask myself the question, how would she land on the riding arena if the horse went out from underneath her by magic? And is the length of her front the same as the length of her back? Are her seat bones pointing down? So is her torso a box? Is she in neutral spine? Or is she showing me one of the banana shapes? And quite often I'll ask the rider where she thinks she is relative to vertical. And very often people who are leaning back quite a long way say to me, oh, I have this real problem. I always lean forward. My teachers tell me how much I lean forward. And I'm looking at them and they're leaning back. And probably what I conclude from this is that once upon a time they did lean forward, and in walk at least they fixed their problem, but they don't realize they've fixed their problem. Once it comes to canter, of course, they might lean forward and have a great desire to put their arms around the horse's neck to make them feel safer, and maybe once they get to canter they're in trouble. But at that point in walk, they are vertical. And I think one of the worst design faults in the human body is that there is no spirit level. We do not have an innate sense of where vertical is. And so I see these people who are leaning back, but they think they're leaning forward. I say people who are leaning forward who think they're leaning back. And you'd be amazed how few people appear in front of me for the first time and are actually vertical. Vertical is an incredibly elusive place, and there should be a spirit level in the human body that we innately know where vertical is, and there isn't. So finding vertical is in no way a foregone conclusion, as is finding neutral spine. So let's suppose right now that you're a hollow back rider. So why don't you sit in a hollow back position? That means you're going to point your seat bones back, you're going to hollow your back, you're going to lift your chest, and this also often goes with lift your chin. If you lift your chin, that can be a part of it too. So to this person, I might say chin down and I might say chest down. Okay, so chin down, chest down starts to make that correction. And very often, if you just put your chin up, your chin going up leads your chest going up, leads your back to going hollow, leads your seat bones to going out the back. And then do the opposite and go chin down, chest down, take the hollow out of your back, feel your seat bones come to down. And if you want to do this sitting on your hands, by all means do, but if that feels too masochistic, you can just do it sitting in your chair. So think of the horse. The horse goes chin up, lengthen the front of your neck, lengthen under your chest, lengthen under your tummy, back goes hollow, and that's just the same as if you've done this in your own body. You going chin up, lengthen your neck, lift your chest, your tummy lengthens, your back goes hollow, and the fix for you and the horse happens when your chin goes down, your chest shortens, your tummy shortens, and your back fills out. Okay? So often I will make a point for the rider of having her notice where her chest should aim. And that's going to depend on the size of the rider, the size of the horse. So I can't make a specific prescription on this, but I can tell you that if your chest aims above the bottom of the horse's ears and his poll, it's virtually certainly aiming too high. Depending on your size and your horse's size, you might have to aim your chest to the poll, or where the brow band meets the headpiece, or the horse's eyes, or partway down the cheek piece, or even sometimes the bit rings. But if your chest aims above the horse's poll, I'll bet you are too chest up. Okay, so hollow your back again, and we're going to work from the other end of the body. So from the other end of the body, when you hollow your back, your pubic bone goes down. So your seat bones are pointed back, your pubic bone goes down. And think about your pelvis. And think about your pelvis as a bowl that is full of a liquid. And think what would be happening to the liquid in the bowl. And I think what would happen would be that the liquid would spill forward out of the bowl. So can you go pubic bone up, think of the liquid staying in the bowl, and see if you can get a sense of where your pelvis would have to be to keep the liquid in the bowl. Okay, so hollow again, feel your pubic bone drop down, the liquid spill out of the bowl. You're inevitably going to do a certain amount of chin up, chest up as you do this. Your front's got longer, your back's got shorter. And then go pubic bone up, think of the liquid in the bowl where it wouldn't spill out the front. And I think you'll find as you do that, your chest comes down and your waistband comes back. So let's do that once more. So we're thinking about the bottom end of the pelvis's contribution to a hollow back. So you go pubic bone down, liquid spills out the bowl, seat bones go back. Along with that, there's a certain amount of chin up, chest up. But think of the fix from the bottom end as you go pubic bone up, liquid in the bowl, feel your waistband come back, feel your chest drop. Okay, so we've done quite a few repetitions now on hollow to neutral, and hopefully you're getting clearer about that difference. And actually, I'm going to do one more repetition where I'm going to go back to the top half of the body again. So before we do this, put your thumb in the little indentation in the middle of your collarbone, curl your fingers sort of back against the palm of your hand so your knuckles are resting on your breastbone, and reach your little finger down towards your sternum. Okay, so hopefully your little finger is by your sternum, your thumb is in the hollow in the middle of your collarbone, and your fingers are curled away so your knuckles are on your breastbone. And if you're in a good neutral, your thumb will be vertically above your little finger. Okay, so now hollow your back, and as you lift your chin and your chest, your thumb will be behind where your little finger is, and your little finger will be ahead of your thumb. And as you drop your chin and your chest, your thumb will get over your little finger, vertically over it. And you could go too far and drop your chest and cave your front in. So now you're going round-backed, and your thumb is ahead of your little finger, and your waistband is going out the back, and your seat bones are starting to point forward. So from there, put yourself where your thumb is vertically over your little finger. And then to where your thumb is behind your little finger, you've lifted your ribs, you've put your thumb ahead of your little finger, and then move your chest down, ribs down to where your thumb is vertically over your little finger. Go the other way to your thumb being ahead of your little finger and your ribs really caved in. Okay, and then go to neutral again. So this actually is a good exercise you can do on your horse with reins in one hand, the other hand, put your thumb and your little finger as they are now, and figure out how you have to be on your horse to put your thumb vertically over your little finger and to get your Well, and then notice where your chest has to aim. So that will give you the visual guide over where your chest has to aim. But that little exercise is worth doing. So I'm going to come back to actually one of the other diagrams we have here. So let's look at all these riders here. So the rider on the right, where you can hopefully see my mouse pointer, is stacked up pretty much like Ebba was, with the shoulder hip heel line. If we took the horse out from under her by magic, she would land on the arena on her feet. Her front and her back match, her seat bones point down. She's a good shoulder hip heel. Okay, so our next rider here has rounded her back, which we'll talk about more in a minute, but that's what you just did when your thumb got ahead of your little finger, your front caves in, your seat bones point forward, and that rider will very often have their heel two down and forward, as you can see in this rider here. So how would she land if we took the horse out from underneath her and she came down on the riding arena? Her bum would be well behind her feet and she would topple backwards. Okay, so I'm going to go to the beginning rider here on the far left. So she's banana shaped with her front longer than her back, and her butt is out behind her, and her chest is too lifted, and her collarbone here is definitely vertically behind where her sternum would be about here. Whereas on the rider we just looked at here, her collarbone here is pretty much ahead of where her sternum would be here. Okay. Now, rider number 2, B in our diagram, her pelvis has stayed fairly neutral, and from her waistband, her upper body has come back. I often call this a sophisticated hollow back. And today is actually the first day of a clinic in Sarasota in Florida with a new group of riders. And one of the riders I taught today is a professional who came into the arena looking like this and was telling me how hard she'd worked to make herself this shape because she'd been taught to grow tall, stick her chest out, be tall and elegant, and she had trained herself into this sophisticated version of a hollow back. So her pelvis was not so far off right, but from her waistband, she had her shoulders come back and her whole top here come back. This rider's doing a hollow back more in the way that more novice riders do it. Okay, the more sophisticated trained riders tend to do a hollow back in this version, and the more novice riders tend to do a hollow back in that version. This version in particular is likely to make you prone to back pain. So I say to people that the first 20 years they'll probably be fine, but somewhere in the next 20 years it's likely to get them, because what's happening is you're squishing the back of the discs, and people whose discs bulge at some point in their life, and if they're really unlucky get herniated, have often had this posture and really scrunched the back of their spine there. And both extremes, actually this extreme too, is another likelihood for back pain. And this person has both all of that strength that you get when I was talking about pressure on your shoulder will go straight down to your seat bones, all of that resilient strength, and is way, way less likely to be in pain. In fact, I had somebody in my workshop today tell me that from 2 of the exercises we did in the workshop, her back pain, for a few minutes at least, went away. So I'm going to go down to this other diagram here. So there's a little bit of a side, it's on stirrup length. So my suggestion when you're starting out is that you set your stirrups at a length where your thigh is about 45 degrees. So here's the thigh bone at 45 degrees here, which would mean your calf comes back underneath you at another 45-degree angle, and you have a 90-degree angle behind your knee. That's good for people for starters. More elite riders tend to have their thigh slightly closer to vertical. So this is a 40-degree here between this rider's thigh and vertical. Whereas with most folks starting off, you're better off with this 45-degree angle. And your foot coming back underneath you means you have to close the angle behind your knee here probably much more than you're used to. And if your stirrups are a lot longer than they are here, you are almost certainly going to hollow your back. If you try and get your thigh vertical, it is inevitable that your back will hollow, because there are ligaments around the hip joint that will only allow your thigh to get a certain angle away from the line of your torso. So here's this 140-degree angle. And if you try to make it much more than that in terms of your thigh going vertical, you will have to hollow your back to get your thigh there. So what we're doing here is kind of presupposing that you have your stirrups around this kind of length. And those of you I don't know and haven't taught before, this could mean changing your stirrup length significantly. I put way more people's stirrups up in their first lesson than I put down, although occasionally I put people's stirrups down. But way more often I put them up. And you might need to get someone to take a photo of you, if you don't have any mirrors, to find the right stirrup length. Because if you try and do this with your stirrups too long, you are going to be doomed. You need to be able to get a photograph of you taken from the side and have you looking something along these lines or something along these lines, okay? So you've at least got a start point here where you've got that line up. So this rider's got her thigh at about that 45-degree angle as a more novice rider. And, you know, you have to be a more rider. So let's go to here. So this rider is Heather Bliss. So many of you will have heard of my association with Heather, who was the alternate on the US Olympic team last year. And on this photo, she's actually a tad ahead of vertical, but you can see her thigh angle and her foot angle and her torso as a really good box. Her front is the same length as her back. She could have brought her shoulders a little bit more back, okay? But she's showing those angles at the elite level, where our little runner, I think she's, which one is she? Here is showing those same angles at the novice level. So the difference is a difference in muscle quality, tonal quality, but you're seeing essentially the same stack up here. So if the rider gets into this posture that we've got here, you're seeing a martial arts posture. This person could be stacked up in a Tai Chi class, or an Aikido class, or a Judo, or another martial arts class, whereas this rider wouldn't cut it in a martial arts class, and this rider wouldn't cut it in a martial arts class, and this rider wouldn't cut it in a martial arts class. And getting that basic martial arts type alignment, like you see here with Ebba as well, is fundamental to really good riding. And if we thought of riding like a martial art, I think we would do a whole load better, that way more people would do way better. And it's kind of like when you look at this rider, you could superimpose a stick figure on her body. When you look at Heather, if we go back to this one here, when you look at Heather, you can see the torso, the thigh, the calf, like you could draw a stick figure on that body. And that sounds so ridiculously simple, it couldn't possibly be true or helpful. But it really is. Getting your body to be like a stick figure is incredibly difficult. And again, we could look at the rider on the right and go, she's like a stick figure. None of these other guys are like a stick figure. She's like a rag doll. I don't quite know what we're going to say these two are like, but they're definitely not like stick figures. So, is the rider like a martial artist? Could you impose a stick figure on her body? Is the front the same length as the back? Would she land on the riding arena on her feet? Those are all good questions. So I think we should come back to round back a little bit again. Let's have you collapse your front, point your seat bones forward, feel your collarbone get physically ahead of your sternum, if you have your thumb on your collarbone again and your fingers on your sternum. So this rider is round-backed, like our rider here in C. Her seat bones point forward. her weight tends to go on the fleshy part of her butt. So as you're sitting in your chair, you probably have more weight on the fleshy part of your butt behind your seat bones. Okay? And as you go from there to neutral, and think of your collarbone over your sternum, your ribs get to lift a bit, and your weight comes more onto your seat bones and a bit of your underneath ahead of your seat bones. And of course, as you're sitting on a chair, you're sitting on a flat surface rather than sitting on a saddle which has the slope up towards the pommel. So you don't get quite the same feeling of doing this that you would on a saddle. But maybe from doing this, if you move between round backed again, and then neutral, and then hollow backed, I wonder from doing this if you can get a sense of where your range is bigger. Do you have a bigger range of movements at the hollow backed end of the spectrum, or do you have a bigger range of movement at the round backed end of the spectrum? And even though you may slouch at your computer and think that makes you round backed, the chances are that you're likely to have more range at the hollow backed end of the spectrum, especially for women. It tends to be guys who are naturally built, the way the male pelvis and spine is. Men are less hollow backed than women and tend to default more into round backed, whereas women default more into hollow backed. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do is just show you a few more of these photos here. So I'm just deciding which one I'm going to go for here. Okay, let's go for this one. Okay, so don't you wish you'd learned this at this age? This is in Rising Trot. The little girl is coming down into the sit. She's great. She's quite a lot bigger than this now. This was taken quite a while ago. If you took her pony out from underneath her by magic, she would plop down on her feet. So she's in the halfway stage in Rising Trot. So at this point in time, her body is angled a little bit forward, but she's got that lovely, what I call arrowhead shape to the thigh and the foot. And you could take the pony away from underneath her. She plopped down on the ground. The slight incline forward of her body is how she needs to be here. And she's got a lovely straight line from her elbow through her hand to the bit. And I have to say, this was the most adorable pony, absolutely lovely pony. She's now on a bigger pony than this, and she's show jumping and doing really well. But I think that's just such a cute picture. And of course, all of us get to wish that we had learnt that at that age. Okay, here's another one. Oops, that wasn't the one I meant to do, but never mind. This is a colleague of mine at home who's a coach, and she's in canter. So this middle phase of canter here is the easiest place for the rider to be stacked up vertical. Her front and her back are a super box. She's got the same length collarbone to pubic bone as she's got from the nape of her neck to the back of her butt. Yeah, so with my mouse line, I can kind of go, that line there is a pretty good match for this line here. She's not banana shaped. Her foot's back underneath her. She'd plop down on her foot. She could be maybe a tad more heel back, but she's certainly close to where she needs to be. I'm going to close those two a minute before I go to the next one. Okay, oh, I ended up with Heather again. How did that happen? So that's another Heather picture. Her back and her front are just the same. Paragon is pushing back too much here. His neck is too up and he's a little bit tight under the gullet, so he's not in a fantastic place. And we'd like to see his hind leg coming more underneath his tummy. But Heather has done a really good line in how she's stacked herself up and how she's organized herself. So I'm not sure if I'm going to get these in the order I want. Let's come to this one. Okay, so this is a photo. This is another teenager riding Astro, one of my school horses, who unfortunately had to be put down when he suddenly got colic earlier this year. And she's in the balance point at the top of the rise. And you can see his cannon bones are pretty much vertical. So that's the phase in the stride where the rider's either at the top of the rise or the bottom of the sit. And we're not quite sideways onto her, so you can't quite see this for sure. But I think if we took the horse out from under her, she would plop down on her feet, albeit at a different stage of the rise and the sit than our little girl who's on the Palomino. So let's go to the next one here. Okay, so here's another canter photo. So this rider is a tad ahead of vertical, but I think she would still plop down on her feet. She doesn't have quite as good a body quality as the other rider we saw in canter. Her muscles will be a little bit less like stretched elastic bands and a little bit more bloopy. And her horse hasn't quite got the same level of really reached into the rein. But she's doing a pretty good job in a pretty good neutral. Okay, let's come to the next one here. Okay, that's our little girl. Okay, so this is my colleague who, the local arm of our business at Overdale Equestrian Centre. So this is a picture of my home base. And she is in that halfway stage of trot. So you can see the horse is at the phase in the stride that photographers really want to get, where the legs make an M shape. And she's got that slight incline forward of her torso that we'd expect to see in rising trot, and would, if the horse was taken out from under her, flop down on her feet. Let's look at our next person. Okay, so we've looked at her before. Let's close this lot and come to the next one. Okay, so here's another rider in down into the sit phase of rising trot. The angles of her body are more closed, but again, whether we see the rider at the bottom of the sit, this halfway place, or the top of the rise, they would plop down on their feet. So I think that's enough from me right now. And Pete, are you there?
Hi, Mary.
Hi there. So have we got some questions from folks?
I haven't seen anything pop up in the chat box yet, so I will ask there.
Okay.
But I do have a couple from people who aren't here.
All right. So maybe we should start with a couple from people who aren't here, and then come back to questions from folks who are here.
So Kat Cady, silver member, she says, for riders that are typically used to being leg forward and possibly leaning back, how do you sell this amount of change as a teacher?
Okay, so usually I manage to get people to do this amount of change, and basically it's the horse that sells it more than me. Because once somebody is leaning back and with their foot forward, their weight is going to be predominantly focused and concentrated down the hollow of the horse's back. So for instance, this rider here in this drawing, especially if her foot were more forward, would have her weight really concentrated on her butt. This rider definitely has her weight concentrated on her butt with her foot really forward there. So once the rider's weight is concentrated basically on that area of their butt and their thigh, you can be pretty sure that the weight that's concentrated in the middle of the horse's back is going to be contributing at least to the horse's back being hollow. And once the horse begins to change underneath them through the reorganization of how their weight is taken, then we can usually sell this change. So if you look at this rider on the right, her weight is distributed down the whole length of her inside thigh, right? This whole area here is weight bearing. It's the same if we go up to this picture here of Eva. The sitting surf goes from her butt here all the way down the inside underside thigh. So virtually the whole area of suede on a pair of suede seated breeches is weight bearing, and the rider's weight is spread more forward on the horse's rib cage than it is in this scenario or this scenario. So I will try and convince the rider through that. I will put my own body into the place that they are and demonstrate it to them. I will put my own body into a martial arts stance. I mean, it's very hard to argue with a martial arts stance. And I will also make it very clear to people that changes they make in their body will feel bigger than they look. So I think this is an important point to make, especially to those of you who are meeting my work through these webinars for the first time. When you make any change in your body, it will always feel bigger than it looks. And this is the same phenomenon as you lose a filling, you get an ulcer in your mouth, it feels to your tongue like a huge, great yawning chasm. You look in the mirror, and what you see is a tiny pinprick. The blemish that felt huge looks tiny. Now, maybe that's more in your mouth than anywhere because your tongue has so many nerve endings, but throughout your body, the change that looks huge feels funny. So I might get this rider into this place, and the rider says to me, I feel like I'm hunched. So she feels like her upper body's in the shape of this rider. But the reality is, the shape she's made has made her like the rider on the right, rider D. But it feels to her bigger than it looks. So I have to make sure I explain that to the rider and that she understands that. And if all else fails, I stand her in front of the mirror or I aim my iPad at her, because at that point in time, it's very hard to argue with what you're seeing. So as they say, seeing really is believing. And if necessary, I will give somebody visual feedback. So I know we've had some more questions and comments come in while I've been saying this, but Peter, I'm going to let you relay to me what you think are the most significant ones here.
Viewer 10 asks, how much do you attribute the saddle fit and saddle style to rider position challenges?
Yeah, well, it can be a challenge. We had a few people today in the clinic having to kind of fight the saddle a bit to get themselves in a good place. And actually, this saddle as it's drawn here has a reasonable amount of space between this rider's butt and a reasonable amount of space in front of this rider's knee with her thigh at this correct angle. And if you go back to this one here, you can see how out in front of her this rider's knee is. And it hasn't come off the knee roll. And this rider, I think, is pretty much 6 foot. And there's space behind her saddle for her butt. Okay, so one of the big problems is not having enough space within the saddle to do that 45-degree thigh without the thigh coming across the front of the saddle. And whenever anybody is on a saddle buying trip, I always say to them that they should buy a saddle where the front line of the saddle here is slightly ahead of vertical rather than being vertical, because if that line of the flap is vertical, there probably won't be enough room for their thigh. So that's one thing. Some saddles, especially older ones, and particularly general purpose or jumping saddles, will have the stirrup bar riveted onto the tree in a way that if you're in shoulder, hip, heel, the stirrup leather has to hang behind vertical. So the rule that the stirrup leather should be vertical is not an absolute rule. It depends on the saddle line or saddle design. And sometimes the rider has to be with the stirrup leather behind vertical in order to be in a shoulder, hip, heel line. And that makes it way, way harder. And, you know, having enough room from your bum to your knee, a flat enough seat so the seat is not curling up right behind your butt, and where the stirrup leather can hang vertical, those are some of the major things. And not all saddles fulfill those criteria. And it's a big deal. Buying a saddle that fits both your horse and you is a really big deal. So I'm going to leave that one to rest there and not pontificate more on saddles.
Jane asks an interesting question about how you work with twists. However, I think that's probably going to be a different chapter on.
Yeah, that's a whole other ball game and something we can't go into right now. So I can certainly head you towards the Symmetry in Circles DVD, the chapters on asymmetries in the clinic book, but I'm not going to dive into that right now. That would be a whole other ball game of a webinar.
Erica sent a question on, and she said, is it important to prioritize shoulders over hip or ankle bone under hip, or are they both necessary? You know, she seems to have the impression that getting the lower leg right first, as it's the base of it all. What's your opinion?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's really true. It's hard to get this right without the foot coming back underneath you enough. And hello, Erica. I think I know who you are. Hi there. It is hard to get this right unless you sufficiently have your heel under your hip. And that's a big deal, that closing the angle behind your knee and keeping that there. So for Erica and Joe and those other the rest of you who are listening who are coaches, so this is just a small handful of you, here's something that you can try. So most of you who are coaches will recognize in yourself that one leg comes underneath you into the shoulder hip heel line more easily, and maybe your other leg tends to go more heel down and forward and is harder to stabilize underneath you. And you'll see that time and time again in the riders you coach, that they can line up pretty well over the foot on one side of the body and struggle to line up over the foot on the other side of the body. So on the difficult side of the body, you could try this as something you haven't tried before. And actually, whoever asked about twists, if you're recognizing that you have a heel that goes down and forward and a lower leg that is really hard to keep underneath you, this might help you. So we've all heard of your six-pack, and from your sternum down to the first line that goes across your tummy would be the two-pack part of your six-pack. So we talk about your two-pack, your four-pack, your six-pack, and the part of your tummy under your bikini line we call your eight-pack. But if you put your hand on your front on what I'm going to call the two-pack line, which is the line in your abs that goes across your abdominals below your sternum, and I think you'll know where it is, and with any luck there should be a place that your hand fits into. And on the side of your body where you're less organized and you struggle to keep your lower leg underneath you, think of your leg hung from that line. So as you're sitting there, push your hand against your body, the side of your hand, the little finger side of your hand, so you're digging it into your body on that line, and push your body against your hand. You might have to use your other hand to support your hand. So I've got the little finger of one hand against the two-pack line, the fingers of my hand curled, my opposite hand curled around my thumb on that line, and I'm pushing my little finger rather vigorously into my body, and at the same time I'm pushing my body into my hand. And my arms are working quite hard to do that. And those of you who know about bear down might notice you're bearing down. And on the side of the body where you find it harder to line up, think of your leg hung from that line. Do what you're doing with this line. Try and push into that line in the same way and hang your leg from that line, thinking of it like a pendulum, almost like your foot has to go back, maybe like it's the end of a pendulum of a grandfather clock and the pendulum is hung from this line. And you might find that if you think of your leg hung from there, you can hold it back underneath you easier than you can if you just think of it connecting into your hip joint. So if you're new to this work, I would probably just ignore what I've just been saying and not lose too much sleep over that. But those of you who are experienced riders and possibly even coaches within this method, it would be really good for you if you can translate my words into a feeling you can go out on horse and experiment with, to see if that really helps you keep foot back underneath you on the side of your body where you find that difficult. So at that point in time, you're thinking of your whole leg hung from the two-pack line rather than hung from your pelvis and your hip joint. So if you manage to make that work with yourself or anybody, I would be interested to get feedback from that, because that's quite a new way of thinking about it for me, but a way I found really productive. So Erica, I don't know if that answers your question. You know, if the rider is behind their foot, they're going to have a heck of a job really holding vertical. And you've got to come at it from both ends. You've got to come at it from the foot, from closing the angle behind the knee, from neutral spine and vertical. And it's a jigsaw where every bit is dependent on every other bit, as I think you well know. All right. So do you have more questions there?
I think that's about it, actually, for questions. There's a comment from Jane about it being her observation that many people walk with the same issues you see whilst riding.
Absolutely.
whether any off-horse sort of stretches and would help.
I mean, there's loads of off-horse stuff that you can do, and both the Rider's Guide to Body Awareness DVD and the Muscle Language set of DVDs, which are more about flexibility and core strength, are great resources for that. But it is absolutely true. People do on horse what they do off horse. And, you know, if you're going to get good at this, it really pays to build up your car seat so you've got a good, firm, horizontal surface, and to really see if you can sit in your car seat with your seat bones pointing down and really notice whether they tend to go forward or they tend to go back. And notice when you're pushing the supermarket trolley. Are you hollowing your back? Are you rounding your back? Are you leaning forward? Are you leaning back? And can you push the supermarket trolley in a good neutral? So asking that question reminded me once of sitting in a cafe in a rather nice little town in England, watching the world go by, and watching this girl sitting having a cup of coffee with her mum in a neighbouring table. And the girl was sitting there looking so round back. She was quite a tall, lanky teenager, slouching in this chair, looking ultimately round backed. And I was watching this thinking, boy, you know, that's a really disorganized round back that she's got at that age. And they had a big dog with them. And when they left, the girl had hold of the big dog, and the big dog set off down the road at a march and pulling on the lead, with the girl going off essentially in water ski motorboat, being towed along by this dog, really hollow-backed. So, you know, she probably had an incredibly flexible body and could really slouch and really hollow, and was being towed off by the dog in hollowback. So whereas watching her in the cafe, I would have thought, God, I bet she's a round-backed rider. Once she went along the road, towed off by this great German shepherd, I thought, oh no, I think she'd be a hollowbacked rider. So notice your patterns. Many people slouch in chairs but walk hollow-backed. And getting yourself to drop your chin, drop your chest, make your front the same length as your back, and do that as you push the supermarket trolley, do that as you sit in your car, can really help. So yes, I think pretty much everybody I've coached over the years who's become skillful but started off as a disorganized rider rather than a naturally talented rider has worked on this off horse as well as on horse. And when we get on a horse, we do what we do off horse, but it suddenly matters. And working on those things off horse also really helps. Okay, so have we had any more thoughts come in from anybody here?
No, I think that's about it, Mary.
Okay, so I think I've kind of covered what I wanted to cover here, so I'm just going to do a little run through of the idea of shoulder, hip, heel. It's in the conventional literature. Everybody's heard of it. Hardly anybody does it. Most people are going lower leg on the girth or heel down and forward. Getting to shoulder, hip, heel means if the horse went out from underneath you by magic, you'd land on the riding arena on your feet. We're also looking for you being vertical. There's no spirit level in the human body. Most people do not know where vertical is. People swear blind they're vertical when they're leaning forward or leaning back. So the hinge of the hip joint that makes you lean forward or back, and the hinge in the middle of your back that makes you hollow your back with a long front or round your back with a long back. Getting those two hinges to where you're vertical and box-shaped really takes some doing. So at that point in time, you'd land on the riding arena on your feet. You're in a martial arts posture. The exercise of sitting on your hands to find hollow-backed, round-backed, or neutral. The exercise of your thumb on your collarbone, your little finger on your sternum, and making sure your thumb is vertically over your little finger. That is a useful one too. Noticing where your chest aims relative to the horse's poll, brow band, eyes, cheek pieces, bit rings, when you're in the right stack up. That can be really helpful. The image of your pelvis as a bowl, and if the bowl were full of a liquid, the liquid mustn't spill out the front, or of course if you're a really round-backed rider, you might manage to make the liquid spill out the back. but you're trying to get where the liquid would stay in the bowl, and that will happen when your seat bones are pointed down, your front matches your back, your torso is a box, and you're vertical. And then, of course, the other thing is getting where you have this kind of stirrup length. So you have these kind of angles, and if your stirrups are too long, this is not doable. And your foot coming back underneath you like this amount of a closed angle behind your knee may be a very big change for those of you who don't have a shoulder hip heel line, because if you don't, the chances are your feet are too forward and your foot needs to come back underneath you in this line by closing the angle behind your knee. Sometimes we suggest to people that they thought of, you know, how Edam and Gouda cheese are sold in wedges. If you had a wedge of cheese behind your knee and you had to hold the cheese behind your knee to bring your lower leg back into this position and not let it be going forward here into that additional heels down position. So only when your heels under your hip, like this rider here, will you land on the riding area on your feet. And as Erica said, that is a big part of what makes the rest of it possible. So for those of you who are more experienced, thinking of hanging your difficult leg from the two-pack line might help you figure out how to get it to hold back underneath you. And hopefully that gives you a fair amount to go on. So my hope is that I can, you know, give some new ideas like that to those of you who are experienced folks within this way of thinking, and clarify some of the different pieces to those of you who are new to this kind of thinking. And you may well need some mirrors or a friend with a mobile phone who can take a photo of you to diagnose your starting point, so you can begin to figure out the fixes that are necessary. And I think what I'm going to do to finish up is just run you through these photographs again, because I think they really are rather nice. So there's a showing us a box-like torso, shoulder hip heel, fire around the 45 degrees. Karen here in canter, showing us actually really nice organization there. She's got herself really nicely organized. Rachel there at the top of the rise, organized really well. Again, she plopped down on her feet. Meet there in canter, still pretty well organized. She hasn't quite had the same muscle quality that we saw in the earlier photo, but she's pretty good. I'm going to close that lot before I go to the next lot. So this one, our lovely little girl here on her pose. I love that photo. That's just so cute. And Karen doing a lovely job on this grey horse. Again, she plopped down on her feet. Her front and her back match. Her torso's leaning forward, as it must be at this point in rising trot. This person riding my pony Ellie. I'm going to close that lot too. So she again in shoulder hip heel, without the muscle quality you see in the more experienced riders, but doing a basically good job, and a good job on this pony too. And here's this one, Laurie, again up in that midpoint of rising trot. It's also really nice and box-like. If you notice her chest, it will probably aim to where the brow band meets the headpiece. Yeah, somewhere about there. And then last one, which is Heather again. So there you are, quite a supply of riders showing us good mechanics in various gaits. And so thank you all for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed this. Sending your comments. Maybe Pete, you should close up and say to people where they should put their comments on this if they want to. So I'm going to say goodbye from me now and just hand you back to Pete as the moderator of this, just to finish up. So Pete, over to you.
Hi there everyone. This video will end up on the Rider Biomechanics site, and you'll be able to add your comments underneath that as Facebook comments. So look out for that in the next couple of days.
All right. So good night, everybody. Thanks for listening.